Power Podcast.
On you guys, I hope the coronavirus lockdown has not affected you guys too much. Man, it's been a busy time for me. Outside things as well as the NBA draft starting to now take hold. So it's official now. We have 205 players that have declared for early entry. If you followed me on my Facebook, you saw some of the breakdown on those I'd say odd numbers to put it in a phrase. But today I want to talk about the idea of what the NBA draft will look like this year. It still looks as though the league intends on playing games this season. One of the ideas that has been floated around, some have seen, Jay Williams put out putting the games on a cruise ship. There's been other rumors about them renting the whole strip of Las Vegas. There's been all sorts of interesting ideas that have been floated out about how the NBA can continue its season. Now, if you're not a stranger to the NBA draft process, you also know that the coronavirus has definitely upset things somewhat, if you will say. For example, we have no idea right now what the lottery picks are because the NBA has postponed that. Due in large part, I think, because of the season. With that, there comes the other question, which is, when will the NBA hold the draft? You could see it in September. You could maybe even see it in October. I don't know. It's going to be very interesting. I think the NFL draft that we saw this past year, just recently, is going to be a lot of what we'll see with the NBA draft. The NBA draft, we're not going to see the crowds at Madison Square Garden. We probably will see more of an isolated event that almost takes you back to the early 1960s and early 70s of when the NBA draft was held in a smoky room on a conference call. We're not going to see that per se, but I think what you see with the NFL draft this past year was phenomenal. I mean, they did just a ridiculous job at, producing a quality event, despite the limitations and despite the oddness of what has transpired this past year. The NBA draft, it has all sorts of ways that we've been used to. We've been used to interviews with guys. I'm sure that they're going to reserve those interviews for a few select people. This year, I will be doing commentary on the NBA draft as it goes on. I know I'm crazy. I did this once before and people really liked it. I haven't done it in a couple years just because of the limitations of my schedule. However, my schedule is a lot clearer this year, as I'm sure a lot of you guys' schedules have changed. So therefore, I will commit to doing, a draft night, if you will, and put together a podcast that basically, runs down the NBA draft. And I'm really surprised by the number of people that have declared, because this year with the coronavirus has put such a monkey wrench into things that you kind of wonder, like, is this something that they can really do? Like, what's going on here? And at the end of the day, it becomes a lot bigger, I think, picture and understanding that we quite don't realize because of all the intricate plot and the intricate details of people, declaring and going back to school, and the recruiting is off with the college game. So there's so many things right now that have to be hashed out in order to really have tangible and quality informative NBA draft content. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk about a debate that I recently have become a part of, and that is, who is the team of the 90s? And what I mean by that is, to me, there's only really 3 teams of the 90s that I would argue deserve a seat at some of the greatest teams that we've seen in the 90s. And one of them is 96 Kentucky, without question, 91 UNLV, and 93 the Fab Five of Michigan. Very interesting. I know what you're about to say. Yes, and I did leave them off. I don't know why. Definitely 92 Duke would definitely play a role in that as well. I think 91 Duke is not as talented as 92 Duke. 92 Duke, you really see the maturation of Cherokee Parks. 91 Duke did lose a little bit, though, with Billy McCaffrey leaving and going to Vanderbilt. But, I just think another year, these guys are better, smarter. Grant Hill started to really mature. Thomas Hill, had a much more firmer grasp on his role because he was essentially splitting time with Billy McCaffrey. So that's why I consider 93 Duke superior to a lot of teams. So with all that said in mind, I think the key matchup that everybody really points to is 91 UNLV, and I really think 1990 UNLV as well as belongs on this list. I think 91 UNLV, the sequel, was undoubtedly more hyped, but I don't know if they were more talented, and I'll go into depth with that, because I think one of the things that people have forgotten about 1990 UNLV is the amazing depth that team had. And some of the pieces, they weren't as spectacular, but they were very effective for Jerry Tarkanian and UNLV's defense. In particular, what I'm talking about is David Butler. David Butler was a much more versatile defensive player, definitely could go out into the perimeter and guard a big man. George Ackles, a way better athlete and a more explosive dunker in the open court, was not as good on the defensive side of things. He could block shots. David Butler did not have the ability to block shots at a high rate like George Ackles did, but Butler knew angles. He knew how to play himself in the post. He was very good at going out. If players wanted to go out to the perimeter, he could follow them. And then I think the biggest piece that people seem to forget is Moses Scurry. Moses Scurry came off the bench and was essentially a 6-man. Now, you take his rebound rate and you match it and give it starter minutes, it would be among the league leaders. I said not league, but it'd be among the team leaders at his position. I mean, he would fill in for Larry Johnson when foul trouble would occur, and he would fill in with David Butler. Tough as nails. A very strong-willed player. And again, I really think people forget that about 91 UNLV. 91 UNLV had Elmore Spencer, who came off the bench, who kind of filled that role for Moses Scurry. Spencer was a very talented player. I mean, as evident by, I think he got drafted 25th in 1992's NBA draft, but he was not the polished player, if you will. He was still learning his body, still learning what he could do and what he couldn't do, which is why he didn't take over the position as starter on that team. George Ackles kind of had that. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but Ackles was actually on the 90 UNLV team, but he broke his wrist and actually had to sit out a year. So I think that is the huge benefit for Ackles, and that's why Ackles definitely started. Now, there were times where Elmore Spencer would come in and fill in, but Elmore Spencer was not as gifted physically, and there were things that he lacked on that team. So which is why I don't think he ever started for them until Ackles graduated and went to the NBA draft. Now, another case in point, two guys that get left off too is Barry Young and Stacy Cianovich. Cianovich was a point guard, probably could have been a starter at any mid-major program at that time. Definitely could handle the ball in those spot-up minutes for Greg Anthony. Now, if you do remember 91 UNLV, you do know that Greg Anthony, when they played against Duke, went out with a very questionable charge call, of course, to Duke. And, really the Blue Devils, that's not the Blue Devils, the UNLV Rebels really didn't have anybody to come off the bench and help them at that point guard spot. Essentially, Anderson Hunt slid over and maybe Everett Gray would come in and play some shooting guard minutes. But Everett Gray and Stacey Augmon were really three guys. They were really small forwards who would occasionally come in and play two guard. They really didn't have the ability, and well, it wasn't even really them. Anderson Hunt didn't really have the ability to play point guard. He was a reactionary passer, not much of an offense guy, and didn't really set up. Great at feel for the game, great at calling, making plays on the fly. That's where Anderson Hunt's bread and butter was as a passer. He was a reactionary guy. Defense would collapse, he would kick out. That was more Anderson Hunt style. Why Greg Anthony obviously was the general, ran the offense, knew where everybody should be, and made sure that everybody was in their proper places. Anderson Hunt wasn't that type of guy. So I think you have all that combined. I think many people think that 91 UNLV is the best team. And, even myself, I do think 91 UNLV is the best team, but when you really break it down, as I've gotten older, 90 UNLV was exceptional when you think about it. Even the guys that didn't play, like Travis Bice, James Jones, those guys were more than capable of filling in, 5-10 minutes. And James Jones, a lot of people don't know this, but James Jones actually played and started for UNLV for the first 10 games of their 1989-90 season because of suspensions to David Butler and Moses Scurry. So they had every ability to set up things and to get things going with guys off the bench. And, that was the biggest thing that they had going for them. That, just the sheer brutality of Larry Johnson working that low post, Stacey Augmon locking down guys. I've said this before. Stacey Augmon to me is perhaps the greatest defensive player I've seen at the college level in quite some time. Again, there might have been others, but they're probably going to precede my timeline of actually watching college basketball. But I can tell you this, he was better than Shane Battier, because unlike Shane Battier, who needed referees to get that charge call, Stacey Augmon had the length, had the anticipation, had the lateral movement to really get in front of guys and really disrupt passes and shots and all sorts of dribble moves. He was exceptional at the defensive side of the ball. And, I think many people seem to forget that about him. Number two, the other defensive side was Greg Anthony. Greg Anthony was a bulldog. He really ran down and chased you down and really, in that amoeba defense, created havoc in passing lanes. And which takes me to the last guy, which is Anderson Hunt, who had very good lateral movement. I've watched some of the older film of him. The lateral movement was tremendous. And in particular, Jerry Tarkanian actually wrote in a book that he felt that Anderson Hunt was one of the reasons why the amoeba was so devastating for those years that he was there, because his lateral movement was so good. He literally could move side to side and really disrupt things as well. On the other side, the Fab Five were definitely formidable. You had Jimmy King, you had Ray Jackson, you had Juwan Howard, and you had Jalen Rose. At the six-man spot, you could maybe highlight Eric Riley and Rob Pelinka. Riley was definitely a good player. Pelinka was their best three-point weapon that they would bring in. For all the talk of the Fab Five, I think the one most underrated aspect of the Fab Five, besides their athleticism and besides their beauty that they flowed with the game in transition, was that they were tough. They talked. They communicated with people. They really got in people's minds. And I know that people looked at that as a negative, but I actually thought it was a positive. They really disrupted guys. Psychologically, Jalen Rose in particular was very good at really getting in people's skin and getting them uncomfortable in game scenarios. Which leads me to, I don't know. I wish I knew Jalen Rose to ask this question, but I did see in old recruiting profiles that he actually did list UNLV as a possible destination. A lot of people don't know this, but Anderson Hunt actually went to the high school of Jalen Rose, Southwestern, who had the great Perry Watson there. And, the story goes that Jerry was one of the few, and again, this is the words of Perry Watson and other people, not me. Jerry Tarkanian was one of the few white coaches that would embrace black coaches in the inner city and give them more than just lip service and the occasional clinic notes or whatever. Would really go out and talk with these guys and discuss strategies and all these other things that more often than not, many of the more high profile white coaches did not do to the inner city black coaches. And Perry Watson told Jerry, when I get a kid that is a program changer, I'm going to send him to you. And, he calls Perry because there's a kid commits to Iowa from Perry's program. And Jerry goes, well, why didn't I get this kid? Perry says, look, he's a good player, but he's not a program changer. I didn't forget about you. And Jerry says, he totally, okay, whatever, and went on. And one day he gets a call from Perry that says he got a kid named Anderson Hunt, and Anderson wants to, commit to UNLV. And what was hilarious is Jerry didn't even recruit Anderson Hunt. But that was kind of how things were done back then. I say all this because Jalen Rose, I believe, was very interested in UNLV because of those connections. And I really believe that if Jerry Tarkanian did not have some of the issues, that college basketball would have been really changed. And I'll explain to you what I mean. Jason Kidd was on record as being somebody who wanted to go to UNLV. Ed O'Bannon actually committed to UNLV. And then when they got into trouble shortly after the 91 debacle, in which there was a photo floated around of some UNLV players supposedly entertaining a guy who was known to fix games in a bathtub. So that kind of created a scandal. And then you had the Lloyd Daniels issues from 1986. And basically that pretty much cooked Jerry Tarkanian's goose at UNLV. We don't know. Jalen Rose could have very easily went to UNLV. It's really not out of the realm of possibility if Jerry Tarkanian didn't have that issue. And it's just interesting because I don't think many people really think about these things because, we're taught that history is what it is. We're not taught of the, history, almost of the consequences that happened that altered history. And Ed O'Bannon was signed, sealed, and delivered to go to UNLV. That's a fact. Jason Kidd was pretty much on the hook to go there. And I'm willing to bet that Jalen Rose, who said his words, not mine, said he loved UNLV and said he loved Anderson Hunt. I don't know if Jalen goes to Michigan. That's interesting enough, right? Okay, so enough of my rambling on. I apologize for that. I just want to make sure I get all the context out of this historically. So this matchup would essentially be Larry Johnson versus Chris Webber. And I think Larry Johnson holds the edge there, but I give Chris Webber as much respect as I do Larry. But I do think Larry. Listen, I think when you really review the 90s of college basketball, there's only a few guys that I would put above Larry Johnson. Christian Laettner, to me, is the number one player of the 1990s era. Without question. I actually think Christian Laettner is a top 10 college player of all time. I wouldn't put Larry in that category. But I will tell you this. I think Larry Johnson is one of the finest Division I players that was around during that time and in that era. And I would put him above Chris Webber. I don't know how much above Chris Webber, but I definitely would put him above Chris Webber. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, you're listening and you have a lean towards Chris Webber. So let's just say this is even. Okay? So then you have Greg Anthony versus Jalen Rose. I don't know how beneficial this would be for Chris Webber. Greg Anthony would have done really well with Jalen Rose, a lot better than I think people give him credit for. You know, he was disruptive. Greg Anthony was disruptive. And you saw Jalen at times struggle in the championship game against North Carolina with Derek Phelps. Now, I'm not suggesting that Greg Anthony is on the level of Derek Phelps. Derek Phelps, to me, is the number 2 perimeter player, perimeter defender in all of 90s basketball. I actually put him that high. So I wouldn't say that Greg Anthony is on that level. But I know Greg Anthony would definitely get in Jalen Rose's headspace and would definitely cause Jalen some issues. If you think you have Jalen going over that, then okay, fine. Jimmy King versus Anderson Hunt. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, that's Anderson Hunt all day. You can think it's Jimmy King. Listen, Jimmy King, great talent, was one of the better defenders for the Fab Five during their time other than Ray Jackson, but not really as good with switches and other guys. And I can tell you this right now, they had a problem with Donald Williams in the championship game, and that was very detailed in Mitch Albom's book called The Fab Five, in which they knew exactly where Donald Williams was going to be, and they knew exactly where Donald Williams liked to shoot, and they still could not stop him. Anderson Hunt doesn't have the stroke of Donald Williams, but he's Donald Williams-esque, and he actually can take you off the dribble. And he has no problem finishing in the traffic. So I actually think Anderson Hunt would be a huge problem for them to deal with. More so than I don't think people quite understand Anderson Hunt. You know, this is a guy that won Most Valuable Player award of all the NCAA tournament in 1990. He was a problem. He created havoc in defense. He was a guy that got hot. He could drop 30 on you real fast, and you would just blink and be like, oh, that's 30 points, Anderson Hunt? Good Lord. That's how fast he was in terms of dropping points. Think Tony Delk with a little bit more versatility in ball handling and everything. I've said this multiple times. I think Anderson Hunt was actually born way early. Because during that time, he could not switch to point guard. He just did not have the natural point guard skill. He was listed at 6'2", but probably more 6 foot or to 6'1". And he couldn't play point to save his life. And during that time in the 1990s, and you know this if you watch 1990 basketball, everybody wanted a Michael Jordan-esque size shooting guard. You had Mitch Richmond, you had Michael Jordan, you had Clyde Drexler. Even John Starks was considered small for a shooting guard in the NBA at that time. He was 6'4". So, you had to have some size to play the shooting guard position at the NBA level. That wasn't going to happen for Anderson Hunt. And I actually think Anderson Hunt was born a little too soon for his liking. But let me tell you something. In the college game, he was definitely a problem. Ray Jackson versus Stacey Augmon. That's not even close. That's Stacey Augmon. David Butler versus Juwan Howard. I would say I would give. I don't know. To me, that's a toss up. And I know people are going to think. Let me explain to you, because unfortunately we've come into this position when we look at teams historically and we say NBA career. We always attach the NBA career to college teams. And to me, that is completely one of the worst things you can do. Because if that's the case, then 82 UNC is the greatest team of all time. And that's just not true. UNC, has 2 top 50 players of all time on their team at one time, James Worthy and Michael Jordan, and then they fill it up with Sam Perkins as well. So, I think people make the huge mistake by trying to equate NBA success to college success. And I'll give you another case in point. 2001, the Blue Devils beat Arizona. Now, you may be saying, well, yeah, that's Duke. Yeah, they should beat. No, if you look at that Arizona roster, it has Gilbert Arenas and it has Richard Jefferson. Let me tell you something. They have a better career those two than any player that Duke has on that team. You have Shane Battier, I guess you can say that's, okay, and Carlos Boozer and Jay Williams. And is Jay Williams on there? I think Jay Williams is on there. And then that's it. I mean, that's essentially it. Yeah, there's Jay Williams, and you have Dunleavy. Okay? Those careers are better than any of those guys. So, to me, it's a god awful solution to have when you sit there and you say, well, you got to do the pro players. That's not true. When Duke beat Butler had 2 NBA bona fide players. Lance Thomas is not messing with Gordon Hayward, and Shelvin Mack is better than Nelson in the pros. So, I think when people do that, I think they do themselves a disservice, and I think they're just trying to shortchange the intellectual conversation at hand because they don't really want to get into the details, because more often than not, if they get into the details, their position on it won't stand up well. So you have all this going on, and then you have the bench. I think 90 UNLV has them beat on the bench. I mean, you have Cianovich, you had Barry Young, you have James Jones, you have Moses Scurry. You have, I guess you could put Voskuhl on that list for Michigan, but he was all right. He wasn't anything special. Michael Talley, I guess. So to me, it gets very, very, very murky when you sit there and you attach all these guys and you say, well, these guys are going to beat these guys because they have better pros. Yes, the Fab Five definitely did better in the NBA than the 1990 UNLV. That's not a doubt about that. That's what it was. No one can argue against that. But when you're in college and you're playing against guys, Juwan Howard and David Butler would have been a serious battle. I actually think David Butler would hold the edge there because I think David Butler, a lot of people don't know this about, this is the one team that would have been the kryptonite for them. And I'll explain to you what I mean. The Fab Five played a lot of psychological games. And I can tell you this right now, those psychological games would not have worked with UNLV. UNLV would have ate their lunch right in front of them and dared them to say something. I mean, even the bench guys on UNLV, the guys that barely got any time, like Chase Jeter, he was all for, punching somebody. He had no problem. You want to fight? Let's do it. He was ready to go. Never mind Moses Scurry. Now, Moses Scurry is actually famous for punching Utah State's coach because he said he was just throwing punches at Utah State people, and anybody who didn't have a tie, he punched. And the Utah State coach had a sweater vest on. I mean, these guys were not afraid to throw something. David Butler as well. David Butler was from, Washington, D.C. He was tough as nails, didn't take nothing for nobody. And I really believe that that's one of the things that 91 UNLV lost with graduation was the toughness of Moses Scurry and David Butler. That was going to be hard for them to replace. Now, they did a great job talent-wise of replacing those guys. I mean, a first-round pick in Elmer Spencer and a second-round pick in George Ackles, great. Definitely outperformed and had more talent. But, and when you look at the tangibles and you look at what these guys brought, 90 UNLV lost a lot. 91 UNLV, I'm sorry. They lost a lot when those doors left. They lost Barry Young. They lost Stacey Cianovich. They lost Travis Bice. They got it with H. Waldman, and they brought in some other guys. Everett Gray was a tremendous player. But Everett Gray still needed some time to adjust. Melvin Joyce was not as good as James Jones. They had guys in there that they tried to, produce, but they just weren't on the level. And at that time, I think a UNLV squad was also starting to see that the JUCO levels weren't paying as much as they used to. There was Jerry Tarkanian, he really made himself quite a bit of goodwill in junior colleges because they really produce for him. I mean, he got Larry Johnson. A Larry Johnson is probably not going to a junior college. It just isn't. And, junior college used to really produce some serious talent that you could count on in the early 80s. By the late 90s, that talent started to be less and less because guys were either getting better academically or were starting to take advantages of going to prep schools in high school. So there were a lot of things that guys did to try to help themselves academically, which is why the junior college route started to be a thing of the past. And now junior college is almost a lost world. You would have to go back to, I want to say 97 to find a junior college player with the NBA skill level, and Sean Marion, and I guess I forgot Quintel Woods in the early 2000s went JUCO. But for the most part, the excitement level of getting a potential NBA player at the junior college ranks, it has all but left. Most kids are going to prep schools where they're a fifth-year player and getting themselves academically ready in order to go into the clearinghouse for their colleges that they want to go to. So for one, I really believe 90 UNLV would beat the Fab Five. I know it's considered blasphemous because people look at this guy, and this guy. But the best team doesn't always win in college. That's just a fact. The best team does not always win. The best team, you can be a best team for the season and you can lose in the tournament. I mean, that's just the facts of it. You can't tell me that the 85 Georgetown Hoyas weren't the best team in college basketball. Now, they didn't win the title, but they were the best team in college basketball. You can't tell me that Phi Slamma Jamma in 1983 isn't better than North Carolina State. You can't tell me that. Like, there are things that, don't get me wrong, and I'm not taking anything from these guys, okay? Look, they won. They're the champs. You got to give them respect. But when you do a one-and-done series, it happens where you can knock off a giant and win when the odds are against you. I mean, it happens. It doesn't really happen like that in the NBA because the NBA is a best of four series. You got seven. Usually, you got 7 games to win 4 games, and usually that ends any randomness of victory. But there still are occasions where the best team of the season didn't win the championship. I mean, look at that year with the Golden State Warriors. They had the NBA's all-time winning record, and they lost in the playoffs to LeBron James in the NBA Finals. Like, it happens. Doesn't happen a whole lot, but look, we just don't think of it because we've been preconditioned to believe that if you win the title, you're the best team. And that's not necessarily the truth. If you win the title, yeah, you're the best team of that tournament, but that does not mean that you're the best team of that whole entire season. Usually if you're a favorite, if you're considered a favorite and you win, then most of the time people say, yeah, well, they were the best team all year long. Like, you even hear announcers say that. So it happens more than people like to acknowledge. And sometimes when you have that, like I said, that best, you got to have that best game and the randomness hits and you have that best game, it happens. I don't believe that 91 UNLV would have lost to Duke 4 straight games. I don't believe in a best of 7 they lose to Duke. But in a 1 game, 1 playoff with a guy like Christian Laettner, who I said I believe is a top 10 college player of all time, oh, absolutely it could happen. Absolutely. I don't believe, and it might get me in trouble here, but I don't believe that UNC is better than the Fab Five. But when you have that, you have to have that 1 game, and that's all you need. And Donald Williams explodes, George Lynch rebounds, and there you have it. I mean, think of the starters that beat the Fab Five. You're talking about Eric Montross. You're talking about George Lynch. You're talking about Derek Phelps. You're talking about Donald Williams. And I'll just wait for anybody to tell me who the small forward was on that team. I'll wait 5 seconds. You're probably sitting there like, I don't know who that guy is. Yeah, it's Brian Reese. Now, here's the interesting thing about UNC. UNC were the underdogs, but when you follow the recruiting rankings, they weren't the underdogs. The Fab Five, they were actually the pre-Fab Five, because Brian Reese was a McDonald's All-American. Derek Phelps was a McDonald's All-American. Donald Williams was a McDonald's All-American. Eric Montross was a McDonald's All-American. George Lynch was a McDonald's All-American. Matt Winstrom, who was on their bench, was a McDonald's All-American. They had a ton of players on that team that were McDonald's All-Americans. They had more McDonald's All-Americans than Michigan did, okay? Because Michigan only had 4, which was Rose, King, Howard, and Weber. That was it. Ray Jackson was not a McDonald's All-American, contrary to popular belief, and neither was Eric Riley, who was on the bench, or neither was Rob Pelinka. And everybody else, they weren't even close to being the McDonald's All-American on Michigan. So UNC had that in spades. And we could say what we want, but Montross and Donald Williams really hurt Michigan in that game. When people sit there and they say, like, oh, well, you got to look at the NBA careers and that's the better team. How are you going to look at the NBA careers and that's the better team, and you have these one-offs that occur that clearly the NBA success, the future success of the NBA, doesn't play a part in that game. So what plays a part in that game is what happens. It's what happens then and now. Doesn't really, the NBA career that people like latching on to when we talk about the best college basketball teams of all time is stupid. Stop doing that. It doesn't make sense. It's not intelligent. Talk about the guys during the time, because that's the best way you can do it. I get so irritated with people who want to talk about NBA careers when we're talking about college basketball. I mean, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't play a part in the game. Now, if you want to say that based on the future success that these guys, quote unquote, had more talent or had more potential talent, okay, I guess. I mean, sure. But Jalen Rose's, 12-year NBA career, Juwan Howard's 15-year NBA career, and Chris Webber's 16-year career in the NBA, guess what? It didn't play a part in that game. They still lost to a team that, let's be honest, man for man, they should have beat. And they didn't. They also lost the year before to Christian Laettner and Duke, which, understandable. I mean, I told you 92 Duke, I think, is one of the best teams of all time. So it makes perfect sense to me. But, when people ask me all the time, who's your number one team of the 90s, I would say it is the UNLV. UNLV Running Rebels of 1990. Followed by 92 Duke. Followed by 96 Kentucky. Followed by 91 UNLV. And then, the Fab Five. That's just how I see it. Now, people can change my mind if they wish to, because look, I've changed my mind. There was a time I thought 91 UNLV was the greatest basketball team of all time. As you get older and you read more and more and you start to research these things a little bit more, I flip-flopped on that and I changed my mind. I still believe it's a UNLV team that's the best team of all time. I just don't believe it's the one that went, 36-1. So it is what it is. I hope during these times, some of us could go back and look at some of the videos of basketball and really get a feeling and respect for what we grew up with. I, in particular, have used this time to reinforce my education of what I saw when I was a younger guy. I already had games of the Fab Five, and I already had games of UNLV on my hard drive. So, I've been watching those games, and more I understand my position and why I feel the way I feel, And in some cases, it strengthened my opinion. And in other cases, it's killed my opinion or made my opinion alter a little bit. So it is what it is. I think it's the beauty of college basketball is that you can have underdogs, and the underdogs don't have to constantly win. I mean, wasn't it Northern Iowa who beat Kentucky with DeMarcus Cousins and John Wall? Like, this happens all the time, and people act like it doesn't. It does. And to me, it's just always weird when people have these arguments with this faulty logic, and then they get mad when you point out that the logic isn't really sound, and then all they do is try to ridicule, or they don't really understand the context of what they're saying. At the end of the day, it's all matter of opinion. You can believe whatever you believe. I used to believe in a singular greatest player of all time. I now don't. I believe that there are guys that sit at a table. Like I said, Wilt Chamberlain, Michael Jordan, those guys are on that table. There are teams. I feel the same way about certain teams. Certain teams are sitting at a table with the greatest of all time. Absolutely. And usually it's about 2 per decade. So, yeah, I have 91 UNLV. I have 1990 UNLV. I have 92 Duke. I have 76 Indiana. But I just think it's kind of funny how we have people who just don't want to hear that. They got this Highlander logic where it's like there can only be one. It's like, no, there can't only be one. On both sides of the conversation, the people who believe that the current players are the best players are the same people who don't want to grant certain concessions. And what I mean by that is, if the latest is always the greatest, then when we take the look at the old players and we bring them forward, are we saying that they wouldn't get the training if they grew up in this era? Sure they would. Sure they would. Are we saying that what they were doing wasn't as good as what they're doing today? Absolutely. And if you're a competitor, you're going to do what's the best. And if you took a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and you raised him in this era, he would adjust. He would adjust certain things. Now, I'll say this, and people hate this part of the conversation because no one wants to be honest about this one point. Certain players have more value in certain eras, and no one wants to be honest about that. Louis Dampier, for example, who played for Kentucky in '67, and he went on to have a brilliant career in the ABA. He's in the Basketball Hall of Fame. Louis Dampier really wasn't highly valued like he should have been during that time in the ABA. People in the ABA thought he was a really good guard, but that skill set that he had didn't really help him in that era of basketball. So, to me, it's always funny how people think that every skill set that transfers is going to have the same value that it once did. Dennis Rodman's rebounding 20 rebounds might not have the same value in today's game. Some players have more value in today's game than they did when they were in it. George Gervin, for example, is a guy who you put him in this era of basketball with a non-physicality. I think George Gervin is going to be almost illegal. I think he would do wonders. Same thing with Dominique Wilkins. There are just certain things that these guys would do that would be as benefit to them because of certain skill sets that they have. They just transfer better. Certain skill sets don't transfer better. It's just a fact. You take a player from the 1920s, he doesn't know how to shoot a jump shot. Back in the 1920s, he might have been Stephen Curry of jump shots, which he didn't really have a jump shot. He had a two-hand set shot, but the modern jump shot was still being in development. You had Hank Luzetti from Stanford, and then you had Kenny Sailors from Wyoming who came in and helped the revolution of that and the evolution of that shot. But in the 1920s, that skill set had value. It doesn't have the same value today, and people don't like to wrap their heads around that. Certain players just don't have the same value, and certain players have more value. It's just the way it goes. And people don't like that, and it's weird to me, and I'll never understand it, because it to me, it speaks of a level of anti-intellectuality where you just don't want to apply what you know to be factual because you feel it takes away from your point of view. To me, that's not the great way to handle things. And we in the basketball community, whether you're young, old, or new, we all, including myself, have to continue to be students and have to continue to evolve our opinions so that when we speak, things are better and more intelligent. Appreciate you guys. I'll talk to you soon.